In preparation for the release of Deadpool and Wolverine, I wanted to go through and watch all the X-Men movies that I hadn't seen before. Fortunately for me, that's not a tall task. I had seen all except for Dark Phoenix and the New Mutants, which is what we're going to talk about today. But unfortunately for me, now I'm out of X-Men movies and I want more X-Men movies and they aren't there. So I guess I'm just gonna have to go and rewatch all of the ones that I've already seen just so I can get my X-Men fill, or maybe I'll finally watch X-Men 97. But as the title suggests, today we're gonna be talking about the New Mutants. Before we get started, I just want to say I'm dealing with a double whammy right now. My eye has been itching for 20 minutes and so I might be scratching it in this video if it doesn't all get edited out. And there's also a frog going absolutely ham outside and it will not stop. So I'm hoping that you just can't hear it. But in regards to the New Mutants, for some reason I thought Daphne Keene's X-23 was going to be in this movie. I remember when it was originally announced, I thought she was going to be the lead and it was going to follow those young mutants from Logan. That's not the case. And after having seen this movie, even though I knew she wasn't the lead, she's not even in it. And I guess I shouldn't really be surprised about that. I think I would have heard something if she was, but she's not, which is fine because after having seen the movie, there's really no place for her in the plot. It would be a completely different movie if she was in there, both in terms of, you know, tone and direction and everything. So yeah, she's not in it. But after watching the movie and realizing that she wasn't in it, and then just absorbing everything and realizing that I never knew anything about this movie to begin with, it just got me thinking about that. The fact that no one ever speaks about this movie, no one mentions it, no one even knows it exists probably, because I've never heard anyone talk about it ever. And there are definitely a few things you could point to, some reasons for why people never mention this movie, not as an individual movie or as part of the X-Men universe when people talk about the X-Men movies. I think a big one for a lot of people might be that there's no characters from the other X-Men movies. There's no Cyclops, there's no Wolverine, there's no Deadpool, there's none of the fan favorites in there. And so that pull that, oh, I want to see Deadpool or I want to see Wolverine just isn't there. And so a lot of people just don't want to care about these characters. They don't want to give them a chance. And that's understandable. I personally enjoyed meeting new characters, but that's just me. I think another reason could be that the stakes aren't as high in this movie as they are in other X-Men movies. You know, in other X-Men movies, we're fighting for mutant rights. You know, there's going to be a war between humans and mutants, and, you know, it's kind of world-ending stakes if you think about it. Or, you know, there's aliens coming in, or, you know, there's a vastly powerful mutant trying to destroy all of humanity, something like that. This movie is a lot more contained. The story is a lot more about these characters, and there's just not a lot of world. You know, you kind of get this very small world where all these characters exist in the movie. Not literally speaking, mind you, but, you know, you don't really get to see the outside. It's all very in a specific place. And you know, there's a few references to the X-Men. You do get a glimpse of the outside world from some of these characters' perspectives very briefly, but they don't really do a lot of that because that's not what the story's about. I think probably the biggest thing that killed this movie, and part of the reason why I never got around to seeing it myself, is all the delays. I remember going to the movie theater and seeing the trailer for this movie. I think it was the original teaser, or maybe it was a full trailer, but it was in the movie theater. And I remember a couple months go by and I'd gone to the movies, you know, 2 or 3 more times, like in a 6-month period probably. And I'd seen that trailer, and then I go the next time and it's not there. And I'm like, oh, I guess it came out and just no one talked about it. No, because another whole year went by and then I started seeing it again and I was like, what's going on? And so any momentum that this movie had really just died with all the delays. It was supposed to come out in April of 2018. And didn't come out until August of 2020, more than 2 years later. I mean, where's the momentum? If you're trying to build hype, you killed it. You built it, and then now it's dead, if you ever had any to begin with for this film. And for those of you who don't know, this movie was delayed originally for reshoots, but then it was delayed again because Disney acquired Fox, and they had to put that on hold because of the whole legal issues with that. And then it was delayed again for the Dark Phoenix release. Disney wanted Dark Phoenix to come out first, and so it did, and this movie got pushed back again. And then finally, it got pushed back again because COVID lockdown, and they didn't want to release it during COVID. And so by the time August 2020 rolled around, any, you know, interest in seeing this movie was gone. A lot of people forgot it existed because it had been almost 2.5 years since the movie was originally supposed to come out. It just faded into obscurity. Before it ever even came out, it was into obscurity. And since no one ever wants to talk about it, and I never see anyone talk about it, I guess that's where I come in. And I'm here to tell you that I was pleasantly surprised. I actually enjoyed it. And now maybe that's just me not having any expectations. My expectations were literally on the floor because no one ever talks about it. The reviews aren't super great, but I kind of like it. And now I'm definitely not saying that this is one of the better X-Men movies. As far as X-Men movies go, this is at the bottom of the totem pole. I don't know about very last on the totem pole, but it's definitely, bottom 3. But that's not even really saying that much, really, because the worst X-Men movies are still pretty good movies. I really enjoy that this is a very small scale story compared to the other X-Men movies, and the stakes are very personal compared to some of the other ones. In other X-Men movies, we're dealing with world-ending threats or things like that, like the threat of war or something like that. But the plot and stakes of this movie are more haunted house-esque, where we're in a central location, and there's a little bit we can do outside and in a couple other buildings. But for the most part, we're here and we're trying to survive. There's danger of us dying, but as far as world-ending threats or even, town-ending threats, they're not there. This is more of us and our survival. And speaking of it feeling like a haunted house movie, that's how the filmmakers describe it. As a haunted house movie with a bunch of hormonal teenagers is how they describe it, and I kind of agree with that. But I guess the only thing that's left out of that description is that the teenagers also have superpowers, which just adds a whole nother layer to everything. I have a confession to make, and it's not even really a secret, it's just something that I've never said on YouTube yet. I'm very bad with horror movies. I get scared very easily. They're just not my thing. It's not that I don't enjoy them, it's just that I can't really watch them. Personally, I love the horror vibe and feel that you get in this movie because it's scary but not too scary, and that's kind of what I need. I don't necessarily dislike horror. I like a scary movie, but I'm just not good with them. And so I like that we get this in this movie. I like some of the scary aspects, even though they kind of got to me, honestly. The smiling men, I never want to think about them again. In my last video I made about Dark Phoenix, I was talking about how the aliens are kind of creepy, but no, the smiling men are actually scary. And I don't necessarily think that the other people and creatures that are meant to be scary in this movie are necessarily that scary, but I think it gets the point across when you couple it with the suspense that is kind of throughout the movie. Horror isn't really something that you see from Marvel very often. As a matter of fact, I think the only real horror in Marvel is Werewolf by Night, which also wasn't really that scary, but I do love the feel of horror that isn't like super scary. So I loved Werewolf by Night. And then also you got some aspects of Multiverse of Madness that are kind of along those lines because you've got Sam Raimi directing it, even though the movie is PG-13 and it's not really horror. You know what I'm trying to say. I think this movie being a horror easily makes it the most unique X-Men movie we've ever seen. There have definitely been, different types of X-Men movies that have been vastly different. Deadpool is a lot different from Logan, but at the same time, I feel like this is more different than the X-Men movies as a whole. And honestly, I think that this being branded as an X-Men movie hurt its success. I'm sure at the time this movie was created, it was just another X-Men movie. It was a movie that was gonna come out under Fox, X-Men universe, and eventually we were gonna continue this story in a sequel or something, or even just have its own spin-off, group of movies, 3 or 4 movies maybe, based around this storyline and these characters. But obviously that didn't happen. And so with hindsight, I think that if this movie was just branded as a different kind of movie, it would have done better, because a lot of people, X-Men fans, look at this movie and say, oh, that's not an X-Men movie, there's just some random mutants I don't care about in there. And then people on the other side might say, oh, it's a superhero movie, I don't want to see that, even if they're fans of horror. And so while there's really no way for them to have known that before the movie came out, I think that with hindsight, if you remove like the 2 X-Men references, the name drops that they do, and you remove the Essex Corporation and just make it like another organization or something, then you would have a perfectly regular non-X-Men movie about, people with powers and their fight to survive. And I think it would have honestly been easier to market that way. I think that the cast does a pretty solid job, all things considered. Obviously, this movie was very rough in the making. A lot got left on, the cutting room floor, and this movie is probably vastly different than the original movie that was filmed with everything that went on and everything that happened. But I think that the cast did a pretty solid job, and there are honestly some great actors and actresses in this movie. I think one of the few things I could bring up about the acting would be that there are some thick accents in this movie. Some of the characters are supposed to have thick accents, and while for the most part they're fine, just here and there it doesn't sound quite right depending on, which actor or actress is supposed to be doing which accent. It doesn't quite sound supernatural, but again, if I'm immersed, then that doesn't really matter to me. If you're good like 95% with the accent and I'm immersed in the story and I'm just, my brain's turned off and I'm enjoying myself, then, you saying a few words here or there as little, hiccups, it's fine. Now, I will say that the accents definitely stood out to me while watching the movie. They definitely stuck out, but not necessarily in a bad way. What did stick out to me as something that kind of irked me a little bit during the movie is that some of the dialogue is a little bit hit or miss. Like, for the most part, it's fine, but then there's a line or two that's just kind of like cringe a little bit. And I don't know if that's necessarily the writing as a whole, like the writers didn't do a good job, because I don't think that's the case. I think it's more of the story and the script got changed a lot. It got chopped up a lot. The movie got redone a lot. And I think it just, they did the best they could with all the changes that they had to make, and having to release this movie almost 2.5 years later. Like, they did their best. And, they tried to keep the story as close to what they were originally trying to do as possible. I think that's just one of those things that, took a hit from all of the exterior factors that affected it. I think the CGI was another thing that looked really good at some points, kind of like the writing was. But then at other points, not so much. You can kind of see cracks in it. And from what I understand, that's another result of all the delays and all the redoing of things that they had to do. A lot of those scenes that I thought looked a little bit off, when I actually looked up this movie, there were scenes that they had to reshoot. And so from that perspective, I think that it's forgivable. Like, the CGI looks pretty good. It looks like all other X-Men movies do, like the more recent ones in some scenes. But then in just a couple, it looks a little bit like you can tell that something's not right. I do think that the things that look the best CGI-wise, however, are the things that needed to. The things that would definitely take audiences out of the immersion if they didn't. I think they nailed those things. I'm not going to specify what, but if nothing else, at least that worked out for them. This is another of the later X-Men movies that has a very short runtime, even shorter than Dark Phoenix. I'm pretty sure this is the shortest runtime of any X-Men movie. Don't fact check me on that, because I might be wrong. But last video, when I was talking about Dark Phoenix, I was talking about how I think that the short runtime really worked for that movie. The story wasn't quite as compelling as the other X-Men movies, and so they didn't try to overdo it. They did what they needed to do in as little time as possible, and it was fine. And with this movie, I feel like they did something similar, but I don't know if it was actually their choice, and that's the problem. There was a lot of chopping up with this movie, and so a lot was left on the cutting room floor. I know entire characters and story arcs were just left out. And so while I do enjoy a shorter runtime that can, make you care a lot in a small amount of time without oversaturating a film, I do think that we could have gone more in depth with a lot of these characters and it would have been better. I think that this movie would have definitely benefited from another 20 minutes. And I know a lot of times people want movies to be longer just because they're kind of being greedy, like not out of, some selfish desire necessarily, but they just want more of the story. That's not what I'm necessarily saying here. This movie was not even an hour and 30 minutes. It was an hour and 29 minutes if I'm not mistaken, because I looked at, the Disney Plus timestamp before I exited out of the credits. An hour and 29 minutes, I'm pretty sure. And that could definitely have been longer. Like, an hour and 29 minutes is not a lot. Like, a short movie is a short movie, but an hour and 29 minutes to introduce a bunch of new characters is crazy. So in this instance, I actually was left wanting more. Not necessarily in a bad way, but I wished we had gotten more. But going back to the cast, I know that Daphne Keane was not in this movie. X-23 is not in this movie. But also, Anya Taylor-Joy is in this movie. Anya Taylor-Joy is in this movie. When I watched it a few days ago, that was not the first time I had seen the poster for this movie. Never noticed. Never looked it up, apparently. Never looked at the cast list. You see, it's moments like these when I realize that I never knew anything about a movie at all. Because Anya Taylor-Joy is not an unknown actress. I know that she was definitely less known then than she is now, but still, this never comes up at all from anyone. And there are some other pretty big, high-profile actors and actresses in this movie as well. I know that there's an actress from Game of Thrones, and there's an actor from Stranger Things, and the only reason I didn't write down their names is because I haven't seen Stranger Things or Game of Thrones. You know, if you were to tell me when I was going into this movie that I had been on set with an actor and an actress from this movie, I would have told you who. Definitely not. But apparently that's the case, because when I looked up the cast list, Henry Zaga is in this movie as one of the main characters, or Zaga, I'm sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong, but he was in Looking for Alaska. And for everyone on YouTube, I was an extra on Looking for Alaska, like 20 days. And so I was on set. I was in a couple of the scenes that he was in. So that's cool. That was interesting. And also Alice Braga, I really gotta look up how to pronounce last names before I start name dropping people. But she was the main character in Queen of the South, which I was also an extra on. I was in a scene with her once upon a time, years ago. And then she's also Sol Soria from the Suicide Squad, which is actually where I recognized her from. I didn't recognize her face from the Queen of the South poster that I had seen a million bajillion times. I recognized her as Sol Soria, which is weird, but it is what it is. Oh, and the people whose names I forgot that I mentioned before, Maisie Williams and Charlie Heaton. I did write their names down, I just didn't scroll down far enough, sorry. But that's all I really had to say about this movie. I quite enjoyed it, to be honest. My expectations were non-existent. They were at a very neutral, 0% expectations, and I was pleasantly surprised. I think that this movie, for X-Men fans, I definitely see why people don't talk about it, they don't really love it, but at the same time, I think if you turn that part of your mind off and you just take it as a movie and not as an X-Men movie, it's pretty enjoyable. I thought that the story was pretty compelling, it was interesting, the characters were interesting, and I had a good time. And that's what I want. I want to have a good time. This isn't really close to a perfect movie. It definitely has its faults, but at the same time, I don't have anything big to complain about, and I think that goes a long way. There are a lot of movies that I think are better than this one that I have something big to complain about. That, I might love 95% of a movie, but that extra 5% is something big that I have to complain about, like a big scene that just doesn't, work for me. But I don't have that in this movie. I have some minor problems with it, but I feel like those are easier for me to get over. So I had a good time, I enjoyed it. I would recommend watching it. Maybe not a bunch of times because it's not gonna be for everybody, but it's worth a watch for sure. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch. But yeah, if you wanna help me out here on YouTube, I'm still trying to grow the YouTube channel. Everything helps, so if you wanna give me a like, comment on this video, subscribe to the channel, or check out some of the other videos I've made, you're welcome to do so. I would appreciate it if you did so. But until next time, bye.